The billionaire CEO surprised her husband at his workplace. But when she got to his office, guess what she saw? Rose H. Turner was 38 years old, and until that Wednesday afternoon in early December 2024, she thought she had the perfect partnership. She was the founder and CEO of Turner Global Enterprises in Atlanta, building a technology consulting empire that generated over $800 million in annual revenue. And for the past 8 years, she'd been married to Bradley, a man she thought she knew better than anyone in the world. That day, Rose made a decision that would shatter everything she believed about trust, loyalty, and the man sleeping next to her every night. She decided to surprise her husband at his office with lunch. Before we start, hit subscribe and like this video. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us create more great content, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's next. Now, let's dive into the story. Bradley F. Nelson worked as a senior environmental engineer for Nelson & Associates, a respected mid-sized firm that specialized in sustainable infrastructure projects. He'd been building his career steadily, managing complex projects and mentoring junior staff. His salary had reached $145,000 annually with bonuses that sometimes added another $20,000. Rose had always been proud of his dedication, never once letting their income disparity, she earned nearly 6 times what he made, create tension between them. She'd celebrated every project milestone, every industry recognition, every professional achievement that brought him satisfaction, even when it meant reorganizing her schedule to attend his company events. Their marriage had seemed unshakable. They had regular date nights when Rose could pull herself away from board meetings and investor calls. They talked about maybe starting a family someday, once Turner Global's expansion into Asian markets stabilized. They'd purchased their dream home in Buckhead together 2 years ago, a stunning modern estate with floor-to-ceiling windows, spending months working with designers and architects, debating playfully about whether the home office should have mahogany or walnut built-ins. Rose thought they were building something real, something lasting, something that transcended the pressures of her public life and corporate demands. This particular Wednesday was supposed to be a routine day for both of them. Bradley had mentioned over breakfast. Monica's eyebrows raised slightly, but she recovered quickly. Of course. Should I reschedule your 2 p.m. strategy session? Push everything to tomorrow morning. Start the day at 7 a.m. instead of 8 o'clock. After Monica left, Rose stood at her window, an unfamiliar feeling settling over her. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe something closer to longing. When was the last time she'd done something spontaneous for Bradley? When was the last time she'd surprised him with a gesture that said, "You matter more than the next deal, the next acquisition, the next board meeting"? She'd been working 80-hour weeks for months, fueled by the Singapore expansion and the pressure to prove that Turner Global could compete with the industry giants. Bradley had been patient, understanding, supportive, everything she could ask for in a partner. He'd mentioned working through lunch. She could change that. Rose spent 20 minutes on her phone, first calling Sweet Auburn Barbecue, Bradley's favorite restaurant. She ordered his usual pulled pork sandwich with extra sauce, mac and cheese, collard greens, and cornbread. Then she called the craft beer store in Virginia Highland and had them set aside a 4-pack of Bradley's favorite IPA, something small batch from a brewery in Asheville he'd been wanting to try. She imagined the look on his face when she walked into his office, bags in hand, ready to steal him away for an impromptu lunch date. Maybe they'd eat in Piedmont Park, or drive to that spot overlooking the city where they used to go when they were dating. She could give him 2 hours of her undivided attention, No phone calls, no emails, just the two of them reconnecting. Rose felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. Hopeful. Optimistic. Maybe even excited. She was always the one being surprised. Bradley bringing her coffee during late-night work sessions, leaving encouraging notes in her briefcase before big presentations, supporting her unconditionally even when her career demanded everything she had. Today she would be the one surprising him. She grabbed her keys, her Valentino handbag, and headed for the elevator, texting Monica. Taking the rest of the day. Don't call unless the building is on fire. The drive across downtown Atlanta took 23 minutes. Rose picked up the food, the beer, and pointed her silver Mercedes S-Class toward the office park where Nelson and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a modern glass building. She rehearsed what she'd say. Surprise, baby. I'm kidnapping you for lunch. Your proposal can wait 2 hours. As she pulled into the visitor parking lot, Rose felt lighter than she had in months. This was exactly what their marriage needed. Spontaneity, presence, prioritizing each other. The executive board meeting had been scheduled for 3 hours. Rose had blocked off her entire morning, prepared for the intensive due diligence review that Lawrence Chin, their primary investor from New York, always conducted with surgical precision. Lawrence asked questions that could last 45 minutes, drilling into quarterly projections, market positioning, competitive threats. Rose had spent the previous evening preparing responses, anticipating his concerns, rehearsing her defenses of Turner Global's aggressive expansion strategy. But at 8:47 a.m., just 13 minutes before the meeting was set to begin, Monica had knocked on her office door with the news. Lawrence's flight was grounded at LaGuardia. Weather delays had cascaded across the eastern seaboard, and he wouldn't make it to Atlanta until Friday at the earliest. He'd apologized profusely, suggested they conduct the review via video conference next week instead. Without Lawrence's marathon questioning, the board meeting moved with unexpected efficiency. They covered quarterly earnings, up 23% year over year. They discussed the Singapore office, which was exceeding projections. They reviewed 3 acquisition targets Rose's team had been evaluating. By 11:17 a.m., the meeting was over, and Rose found herself standing in her corner office with an unfamiliar commodity. Unexpected free time. Monica appeared moments later, tablet in hand, already problem-solving. I can pull up your email backlog, she said, swiping through Rose's schedule. You have 127 unread messages. I can also move up the strategy session from 2 p.m. if you want to get ahead of tomorrow's. No. The word came out before Rose had fully processed the thought. Monica's head snapped up, genuine surprise crossing her face. In 4 years of working together, Rose Turner had never turned down an opportunity to work ahead, to gain an advantage, to use every available minute to strengthen her company's position. I'm taking the afternoon, Rose heard herself continue. Something personal. Monica recovered quickly, professional as always, but her eyebrows had risen a fraction. Of course. Should I reschedule the 2 p.m.? Push everything to tomorrow. Start the day at 7 a.m. instead of 8 o'clock. After Monica left, Rose stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, watching Atlanta spread out below her like a kingdom she'd conquered through sheer will and relentless strategy. The December sun caught the glass facades of surrounding towers, throwing light across the city she'd claimed as her own. But standing there in the empire she'd built, Rose felt something unexpected. Not triumph, but emptiness. A hollow space where something vital should have been. When had she last surprised Bradley with anything beyond a hurried kiss goodbye and a promise to be home before midnight? When had they last had a spontaneous moment that wasn't scheduled between conference calls and board meetings? She thought about their breakfast that morning, Bradley mentioning he'd be working through lunch on the water treatment proposal. His team was under deadline pressure, racing to finalize technical specifications before Friday's submission. The idea formed quickly. She could change his day. She could show up with his favorite meal, steal him away for an impromptu lunch, give him 2 hours where Turner Global and Nelson and Associates didn't exist. Just the two of them, reconnecting the way they used to before her company consumed every waking hour. Rose grabbed her phone and called Sweet Auburn Barbecue, ordering Bradley's usual without needing to think about it. Pulled pork sandwich with extra sauce, mac and cheese, collard greens. Mrs. Turner, Keisha said, her voice pitched slightly too high, too bright, the way people sound when they're performing normalcy rather than living it. We weren't expecting you today. Rose smiled, lifting the bags of food as explanation. I know. I'm surprising Bradley with lunch. Is he in his office? The question should have been simple. Keisha should have smiled back, made a comment about how lucky Bradley was, maybe buzzed his extension to let him know his wife was here. Instead, Keisha's fingers hovered over her keyboard, frozen mid-reach for her phone. Her eyes darted toward the hallway leading to the executive elevators, then back to Rose. The hesitation lasted maybe 3 seconds, but Rose had spent 2 decades reading micro-expressions across negotiating tables, catching the tiny tells that revealed when someone was hiding information, holding back, protecting a secret. Yes, Keisha finally said, her hand dropping away from the phone. He should be up on 12. You know the way. Rose thanked her and turned toward the elevators, but the interaction nagged at her like a splinter beneath the skin. Keisha had always been effusive, chatty, asking about Rose's latest Forbes interview or complimenting her suits. Today, she'd barely made eye contact. Today, she'd looked at Rose the way people look at someone walking unknowingly toward disaster, with sympathy they can't express and knowledge they can't share. You're being paranoid, Rose told herself, pressing the elevator call button. She's busy. It's lunchtime. Not everything is a conspiracy. But as Rose walked through the third-floor open workspace, the area where junior engineers and project coordinators had their cubicles, she noticed 2 young men standing near the coffee station. One of them Rose vaguely recognized from Nelson and Associates' summer barbecue, a lanky engineer with red hair who'd spent 10 minutes nervously asking her advice about breaking into the tech consulting sector. They were deep in conversation, heads bent close, voices low and urgent. The moment they saw Rose, the conversation died. The red-haired engineer's eyes widened fractionally. His colleague, a black man in his late 20s wearing a Nelson and Associates polo shirt, turned to look at Rose, and his expression cycled through surprise, discomfort, and finally something that looked uncomfortably like pity. He elbowed the red-haired engineer, who managed a tight, awkward smile. Mrs. Turner, the red-haired engineer said, his voice strained. Good to see you. Rose nodded, returning the smile, but neither man moved. They stood there, frozen, watching her walk past as if she were a condemned prisoner heading toward execution and they were helpless witnesses to her fate. The red-haired engineer opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it, glancing at his colleague who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Rose's grip tightened on the bags of food. The elevator chimed, doors sliding open, and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the 12th floor where the senior engineers and partners had their offices. As the doors closed, she caught one last glimpse of the two young engineers, still standing by the coffee station, watching her disappear with expressions that made her stomach tighten. The elevator hummed upward, and Rose stared at her reflection in the polished metal doors. She looked exactly as she had 20 minutes ago. Powerful, composed, elegant in her gray Armani suit. But something had shifted. The air in Nelson and Associates felt wrong, charged with a tension she couldn't name. People were looking at her differently, treating her differently, as if she'd suddenly become fragile or tragic or deserving of sympathy she hadn't earned. "Stop it," Rose commanded herself. "You're reading into things that aren't there." People get awkward around CEOs. They don't know how to act. That's all this is. But Rose hadn't built Turner Global Enterprises from nothing by ignoring her instincts. She'd learned early in her career that intuition wasn't mystical. It was pattern recognition operating faster than conscious thought. Her subconscious was processing thousands of microsignals her rational mind hadn't yet assembled into coherent understanding. Keisha's hesitation, the engineer's abrupt silence, the way that young man had looked at her with pity. The elevator slowed, chiming softly as it reached the 12th floor. The doors slid open onto a quiet hallway carpeted in corporate gray, walls lined with framed photographs of Nelson and Associates' major projects. Water treatment facilities, sustainable housing developments, municipal infrastructure. It was 1:32 p.m. on a Wednesday, and most people were at lunch. The floor felt empty, hushed, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Rose stepped into the hallway, bags of food growing heavier in her hands, and walked toward Bradley's corner office at the end of the hall. With each step, the feeling of wrongness intensified. But she kept walking, because Rose H. Turner had never been the kind of woman who turned back when something felt difficult. She walked forward. She confronted. She demanded truth. And in less than 2 minutes, she would get more truth than she'd ever wanted. Bradley's office was at the end of the hallway, a corner suite with windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. Rose had been here dozens of times, bringing him forgotten documents, meeting him for lunch when her schedule allowed, attending Nelson and Associates holiday parties where spouses mingled with engineers and partners. She knew this space. She knew Bradley's habits. He kept his door closed when working on sensitive proposals, protecting confidential technical specifications and client information from casual observation. Today, the door was ajar. Not wide open, but cracked enough that Rose could see a sliver of the interior. The edge of Bradley's mahogany desk, the corner of his leather chair, the floor-to-ceiling windows that made his office feel expansive and light-filled. Rose's footsteps slowed as she approached, the bags of food suddenly feeling unbearably heavy in her hands. She was 10 feet away when she heard it. Laughter. Not Bradley's professional laugh, the one he used in meetings or on client calls. Polite, measured, appropriate. This was different. Lower. Intimate. The kind of laugh that happened in private moments, when guards were down and pretense unnecessary. Rose knew that laugh. She'd heard it in their bedroom on lazy Sunday mornings, during stolen moments when the world shrank to just the two of them. She heard it now, coming from Bradley's office, and it stopped her cold. Rose moved closer, her body operating on instinct now, her mind trying desperately to construct innocent explanations even as her gut screamed warnings. She reached the doorway, positioned herself at an angle where she could see through the gap without being seen, and looked inside. Bradley stood by the window, backlit by the December sun streaming through the glass. His suit jacket was draped over his chair, his tie loosened, his white dress shirt crisp and perfectly fitted to his athletic frame. And in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder with a comfort that spoke of repetition and familiarity, was Jasmine Reed. The 26-year-old project coordinator Rose had met at her networking event 6 months ago. The brilliant young woman Rose had mentored, advised, and personally recommended for hire at Nelson & Associates because Bradley had asked her to help someone with potential navigate the corporate world. Jasmine, who'd sent Rose a thank you card with handwritten notes about how grateful she was for Rose's guidance, how much it meant to have a successful black woman believe in her. Jasmine, whose head was nestled against Bradley's chest like she belonged there. Rose watched, frozen, as Bradley's hand moved up to stroke Jasmine's hair with a tenderness that made something crack open in Rose's chest. His fingers traced down her spine, gentle and possessive. Jasmine tilted her head back, looking up at him, and Rose saw her husband's face transform into an expression she recognized: desire, affection, intimacy. The expression he'd given Rose countless times across 8 years of marriage. Then Bradley cupped Jasmine's face in his hands and kissed her. Not a peck. Not a mistake. A deep, consuming kiss that left no room for misinterpretation or innocent explanation. Jasmine's arms wound around his neck. Bradley pulled her closer, his hand sliding down her back. They moved together with a familiarity that could only come from practice, from repetition, from months of doing exactly this in stolen moments when the world wasn't watching. The bag of food slipped from Rose's hand. She caught it before it hit the ground, her reflexes saving her from discovery, but the movement jerked her back to awareness. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, a drumbeat that drowned out everything else. Her hands were shaking. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused entirely on the scene unfolding in Bradley's office. Her husband, her marriage, her trust, all of it burning to ash while she stood helpless in a hallway watching the person she loved most betray everything they'd built. Every instinct screamed at her to burst through that door, to confront them, to demand explanations and accountability and some impossible restoration of the reality that had existed 10 seconds ago. But Rose H. Turner hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by acting on emotional impulse. She'd built it through strategy, through patience, through gathering all available information before making calculated moves that her opponents never saw coming. Her CEO instincts overrode everything else. She needed to get out. She needed to think. She needed to plan. Rose stepped back from the doorway, moving silently on the carpeted floor. Bradley and Jasmine remained oblivious, lost in each other, completely unaware that Rose had seen everything. She turned and walked back down the hallway, her stride controlled and measured despite the chaos screaming through her mind. She passed the empty cubicles, reached the elevator, pressed the button with a hand that didn't shake because she wouldn't allow it to shake. The doors opened. Rose stepped inside. As they closed, sealing her into the small metal box, she caught her reflection in the polished doors. Still composed, still powerful, still every inch the woman who'd graced the cover of Forbes. But behind that reflection, behind the carefully maintained facade, Rose H. Turner's world had just shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. And the only question that mattered now was what she would do about it. Rose made it to the parking lot before the trembling started. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her key fob, the Mercedes chirping twice before she managed to unlock it. She slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and sat in the sudden silence of her car, the bags of food, Bradley's favorite meal, carefully selected, lovingly purchased, still clutched in her lap like evidence of her own stupidity. The first wave hit then. Not tears, but something rawer, a physical sensation like her chest was caving in, ribs collapsing around a heart that had just learned it had been beating for a lie. Rage flooded through her, white-hot and consuming, demanding she march back into that building and destroy them both with the fury they deserved. Grief followed immediately after, a crushing weight that made breathing feel impossible. And underneath it all, disbelief, the stubborn, desperate part of her brain still insisting she'd misunderstood, misinterpreted, that there was some innocent explanation for why her husband had been kissing another woman with the tenderness he'd promised only to her. Rose pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel it all. 30 seconds to be the devastated wife, the betrayed partner, the woman whose world had just imploded. She counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Breathing through the waves of emotion that threatened to drown her. 28, 29, 30. Then she lifted her head, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and became the CEO again. She didn't start the car immediately. Instead, Rose sat in the driver's seat of her Mercedes and forced herself to think strategically. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford, not yet, not until she had all the information. She'd built Turner Global by staying 3 steps ahead of competitors who underestimated her, by gathering intelligence before making moves, by never acting on incomplete data. This situation, this betrayal, required the same discipline. Rose started the car and drove back to Midtown, navigating Atlanta traffic on autopilot while her mind worked through scenarios and strategies. She didn't go home. Home was compromised now, a crime scene she couldn't enter without seeing everything differently. Instead, she drove straight to Turner Global's headquarters, the gleaming 42-story tower that bore her name and her legacy. She took her private elevator to the penthouse suite, bypassing the executive floor where her team would be working, where Monica would ask questions Rose wasn't ready to answer. The penthouse was her sanctuary, a space designed for the moments when running an empire required absolute privacy and complete focus. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of Atlanta. Her desk, custom-built from reclaimed wood, sat in the center like a command station. This was where Rose made the decisions that shaped her company's future. Today, she would make decisions that would shape her life. Rose sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began making calls. First, she pulled up the contact information for Marcus Chen, a private investigator her head of security, David Rodriguez, had used for sensitive corporate matters, vetting potential executives, investigating insider trading suspicions, gathering intelligence on hostile takeover attempts. Marcus was discreet, thorough, and expensive. Perfect. "Marcus, it's Rose Turner," she said when he answered. Her voice was steady, controlled, betraying nothing of the chaos beneath. "I need your services for a personal matter. Complete surveillance on 2 individuals. My husband, Bradley Nelson, and a woman named Jasmine Reed. I need to know everywhere they go, everyone they meet, how long this has been happening. Documentation, photographs, timestamps. Everything that would hold up in court." Marcus asked no questions beyond the practical details. Addresses, vehicle descriptions, places of employment. He'd worked with Rose long enough to know she didn't hire him for matters that weren't serious. "I'll start immediately," he said. "You'll have a preliminary report within 48 hours. Next, Rose called Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic accountant Turner Global retained for merger due diligence. Patricia had a PhD in accounting from MIT and a reputation for finding financial irregularities others missed. She'd saved Rose millions by uncovering creative accounting in companies Rose had considered acquiring. "Patricia, I need a complete forensic analysis of all accounts my husband has access to," Rose said, pulling up her banking information on her laptop. Joint checking, joint savings, credit cards, anything with his name or signature authority. I need to know every transaction for the past 12 months. Where money went, what it purchased, any patterns that suggest undisclosed expenditures. And I need it done quietly. Patricia's voice was calm, professional. Time frame: 1 week. Sooner if possible. Consider it done. Rose ended the call and sat back in her chair, looking out over the city she'd conquered. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere out there, Bradley was still in his office, still with Jasmine, still believing his wife had no idea that her surprise visit had revealed the truth he'd been hiding. He was wrong. Rose knew now. And by the time she was finished gathering evidence, documenting betrayal, and building her case, Bradley F. Nelson would understand exactly what it meant to underestimate the woman who'd built an empire from nothing. She wouldn't act on emotion. She would act on strategy. And she would win. Rose arrived home at 5:47 p.m., pulling into the circular driveway of their Buckhead estate with 43 minutes to prepare for the performance of her life. She parked in the garage next to Bradley's empty spot. He typically arrived home between 6:30 and 7 p.m. and walked through the mudroom into their chef's kitchen, the space they'd spent months designing with Italian marble countertops and custom cabinetry that cost more than most people's cars. Everything looked exactly as it had this morning when she'd left for her board meeting, imagining a routine day that would end with her and Bradley discussing their weeks over wine. Now, standing in this kitchen, Rose saw it differently, as a stage where she would deliver the most critical performance of her life. She couldn't let Bradley know what she'd seen. Not yet. Not until Marcus and Patricia had gathered every piece of evidence she needed to dismantle him completely. Rose ordered dinner from Desta, their favorite Ethiopian restaurant, requesting Bradley's usual Doro Wat, Kitfo, and extra injera. She set the dining room table with their everyday dishes, not their fine china, maintaining the casual Wednesday evening routine Bradley would expect. She changed out of her Armani suit into jeans and a cashmere sweater, the kind of comfortable outfit she wore when she had no evening meetings and could finally breathe. She poured herself a glass of Cabernet and waited. Bradley's Audi pulled into the garage at 6:43 p.m. Rose heard the car door slam, his footsteps through the mudroom, the familiar sounds of her husband coming home after a day at work. A day that included kissing another woman in his office while his wife stood in the hallway watching her marriage die. "Hey, babe," Bradley called out, his voice warm and easy as he walked into the kitchen. He crossed to where Rose stood by the wine bottle and kissed her cheek, the same casual greeting he'd given her thousands of times across 8 years of marriage. Rose forced herself not to flinch, not to pull away, not to scream at him to get his lying mouth away from her skin. "Hey," she said, her voice steady. "How was your day?" "Exhausting," Bradley said, loosening his tie. "We're finalizing the water treatment proposal. My entire team is running on fumes." He opened the refrigerator, grabbed a beer, twisted off the cap. "How about you? How was the board meeting?" Rose took a sip of wine, using the moment to compose her face into an expression of casual interest rather than the disgust churning in her stomach. "It ended early, actually. Lawrence's flight got canceled, so we wrapped up in 2 hours instead of 3. "That's rare," Bradley said, leaning against the counter. What did you do with the extra time? The question was innocent, conversational, the kind of thing spouses asked each other every day. But Rose heard it differently now, heard the potential trap in it, the possibility that someone at Nelson and Associates had mentioned seeing her, that Keisha or those junior engineers had told Bradley his wife had come to surprise him. She needed to navigate this carefully. Caught up on emails, made some calls, Rose said smoothly. Then I came home early. Figured we could have a quiet dinner together for once. Bradley smiled, genuine warmth in his eyes, and Rose felt something cold settle into her chest. He was good at this. Convincing. Completely comfortable lying to her face while pretending to be the devoted husband who supported her empire and loved her unconditionally. Over dinner, Bradley talked enthusiastically about the proposal, explaining technical details about sustainable water filtration systems and municipal infrastructure requirements. Rose watched him carefully, studying the man she'd shared a bed with for 8 years, looking for tells she'd somehow missed. When had he started wearing that cologne? Something expensive and woody she didn't recognize. How long had he been going to the gym 5 days a week instead of 3? When did he start keeping his phone face down on the table, checking it compulsively throughout dinner? The signs had been there. She'd dismissed them, rationalized them, trusted him completely because in her mind, their marriage was solid, unshakable, built on a foundation of mutual respect and partnership. She'd been wrong. You seem distracted, Bradley said, reaching across the table to touch her hand. Everything okay? Rose looked at him, at his concerned expression, his gentle touch, his performance of being the caring husband, and felt nothing but cold, calculating fury. I'm fine, she said. Just tired. Long week. That night, Rose lay in their king-sized bed, Bradley's arm draped over her waist in the way he always slept, and stared at the ceiling in the darkness. Bradley's breathing deepened, evening out into the rhythm of sleep, but Rose remained wide awake, her mind replaying the past year like footage she was analyzing for clues she'd missed. The weekend trip to Savannah he'd taken alone, claiming he needed to decompress from work stress. The late nights at the office that became more frequent after Rose closed the Singapore deal. The way he'd encouraged her to travel more for business, supported her relentless schedule, never complained about her absence, because her absence gave him freedom to be with Jasmine. Rose turned her head slightly, looking at Bradley's sleeping face in the dim light filtering through their bedroom windows. He looked peaceful, content, completely unburdened by guilt or conscience. And in that moment, Rose made a silent vow. By the time she was finished, Bradley F. Nelson would understand that underestimating Rose H. Turner was the most catastrophic mistake of his life. Rachel spread the documents across Rose's conference table. Photographs, financial statements, legal correspondence, creating a mosaic of betrayal that would have destroyed a weaker person. But Rachel had learned over 2 decades of practice that her wealthiest clients rarely broke down in her presence. They compartmentalized. They strategized. They treated their personal disasters with the same clinical precision they brought to hostile takeovers. Rose H. Turner was no exception. Let me explain what Bradley's planning, Rachel said, opening a manila folder containing Thomas Hartwell's consultation notes. Hartwell specializes in breaking prenuptial agreements in high-growth situations. His strategy is textbook. Claim constructive abandonment, argue unconscionability, and leverage Georgia's equitable distribution laws to claim a portion of Turner Global's growth during the marriage. Rose sat across from her, perfectly composed in a black Saint Laurent suit, her expression revealing nothing. Define constructive abandonment. It's a legal theory that a spouse's behavior, in this case, your demanding career, constituted emotional abandonment of the marriage, making the prenuptial agreement unenforceable. Hartwell will argue that when you signed the prenup 8 years ago, Turner Global was worth $50 million. Now it's worth over $800 million. He'll claim the agreement didn't contemplate this level of growth and that enforcing it would be unconscionable. Grossly unfair to Bradley. Rachel slid a document across the table. This is where it gets worse. Marcus obtained these through legal channels. They're notes Bradley has been keeping for at least 6 months, possibly longer. Rose picked up the pages, scanning Bradley's handwriting documenting moments from their marriage with prosecutorial precision. November 12th. Rose missed our anniversary dinner. Said Singapore deal required her presence. Home at 11:47 p.m. July 23rd. Rose left for London trip. Gone 9 days instead of planned 5. Didn't call for 3 days. April 6th. Cancelled vacation to Napa. Board meeting couldn't be rescheduled. I packed for both of us. The entries continued for pages, each one painting Rose as an absent career-obsessed spouse who'd prioritized Turner Global over her marriage. Some were accurate. Others were deliberately misleading, omitting context that would explain Rose's decisions or Bradley's own encouragement of her business travel. He's been building a case, Rose said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. Documenting evidence to make me look like I abandoned our marriage while he played the supportive, neglected husband. Exactly, Rachel confirmed. Hartwell's strategy is to argue that you emotionally abandoned Bradley while Turner Global's value exploded during the marriage. Under Georgia's equitable distribution laws, he'll claim Bradley is entitled to a portion of that growth, potentially hundreds of millions, regardless of your prenuptial agreement. He'll position Bradley as the supportive spouse who sacrificed his own ambitions to support yours, only to be cast aside when you no longer needed him. Rose set down the papers, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He's been planning this for months. The affair with Jasmine wasn't just about sex or midlife crisis. It was part of a larger strategy to position himself as the victim while systematically stealing from me and preparing to claim half my company. That's my assessment, Rachel said. And based on Hartwell's track record, it's a strategy that could work. Georgia courts have shown sympathy for spouses in Bradley's position. The partner who supported the high earner's success and now faces divorce with comparatively little to show for it. Rose stood and walked to her windows, looking out over the city she'd conquered through relentless determination and strategic brilliance. Behind her, Rachel waited, understanding that her client needed a moment to process the magnitude of Bradley's betrayal. This wasn't just infidelity. This was warfare disguised as marriage, a calculated campaign to exploit Rose's trust and success for Bradley's financial gain. What are our options? Rose asked, her back still to Rachel. Rachel pulled out a legal pad, her pen poised. We move first. We move decisively. And we move in a way that protects your assets and your reputation. The prenuptial agreement is solid, but we need to undermine Hartwell's abandonment argument before he can make it in court. We'll document Bradley's affair, his financial theft, his use of company resources for personal matters. We'll show that Bradley wasn't the neglected spouse. He was the opportunistic predator who exploited your success while planning your destruction. Rose turned from the window, her expression hardening into the mask she wore in boardroom battles. Timeline: 2 weeks. We'll need to coordinate with Nelson and Associates senior partners. I'll present them with evidence that Bradley conducted an affair with a junior employee using company resources, potentially exposing the firm to liability. They'll terminate him to protect themselves. Simultaneously, we'll file divorce papers with full prenuptial enforcement and prepare a statement for media release if Bradley contests. We control the narrative from the beginning. Do it, Rose said. Schedule the confrontation for Saturday morning, 2 weeks from tomorrow. I want him to walk downstairs expecting a quiet weekend and find his entire world dismantled. Rachel made notes on her legal pad, already mentally organizing the logistical choreography required to execute Rose's counterattack. Rose, I need to ask, are you prepared for how ugly this might get? Bradley clearly believed he could outsmart you. When he realizes you've known all along and let him think he was winning, his reaction could be volatile. Rose's smile was cold, calculated, containing no warmth. Bradley made the mistake of thinking my success made me vulnerable. He's about to learn that everything I've built, Turner Global, my reputation, my empire, I built by destroying people who underestimated me. He declared war on the wrong woman. Marcus Chen's preliminary report arrived in Rose's private email at 11:47 p.m. on Friday, exactly 41 hours after she'd hired him. Rose was in her home office, door locked, Bradley asleep upstairs, when the encrypted file downloaded onto her laptop. She opened it with hands that had stopped shaking days ago, replaced now by a cold surgical focus that felt more familiar than grief. The report was comprehensive, methodical, devastating. The affair had begun 8 months ago, March 15th to be precise. Marcus had traced it back through credit card receipts, social media metadata, and surveillance footage from the restaurant where Bradley and Jasmine had their first dinner alone. 8 months ago. 3 weeks after Rose had closed the Singapore deal, the contract that added $200 million to Turner Global's valuation and cemented her position as one of Atlanta's most successful CEOs. While Rose had been celebrating the biggest professional victory of her career, Bradley had been planning his betrayal. Marcus had included photographs, each one time-stamped and geotagged with forensic precision. Bradley and Jasmine at La Grotta Ristorante, an upscale Italian restaurant in Buckhead, their hands intertwined across a candlelit table. Bradley and Jasmine entering a luxury apartment building on Peachtree Road, Bradley's arm around her waist in a gesture of comfortable intimacy. Bradley and Jasmine on a weekend trip to Savannah. The same weekend in September when Bradley had told Rose he needed a solo fishing trip with college friends to decompress from work stress. In the photographs, Bradley and Jasmine walked along River Street, ate at the Grey, checked into a boutique hotel that cost $400 a night. Rose stared at the images, her face reflected in her laptop screen superimposed over evidence of her husband's systematic deception. She felt nothing. The grief had crystallized into something harder, more useful. Strategy. Planning. The cold calculation she brought to hostile negotiations and corporate warfare. Dr. Patricia Williams's financial analysis arrived 2 days later. A 100-page document that read like a thriller about financial betrayal. Patricia had found what Rose suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Bradley had been systematically siphoning money from their joint accounts for 8 months, perfectly synchronized with the affair's timeline. The transfers were clever, calculated to avoid detection. Never more than $8,000 at once, staying below the $10,000 threshold that would trigger automatic bank alerts. Always spaced irregularly. $5,000 on March 22nd, $7,500 on April 8th, $6,200 on April 30th, creating no obvious pattern. The money flowed from their joint accounts into Bradley's personal checking account, then disappeared into cash withdrawals and payments that funded his double life. Patricia had traced every dollar. The Buckhead apartment lease in Jasmine's name. $3,200 monthly, paid in full for 6 months. Designer gifts purchased at Phipps Plaza and Lenox Square. A Gucci handbag, Tiffany jewelry, La Perla lingerie. Expensive dinners at Atlanta's finest restaurants. Bacchanalia, Staple House, Canoe. The kind of places Bradley claimed were too pretentious when Rose suggested them for their anniversary. Weekend trips documented through hotel charges and rental car receipts. Total amounts siphoned from their joint accounts over 8 months. $127,000. Rose sat in her office, the financial report spread across her desk, and felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just an affair. This was theft. Systematic, calculated theft of money she'd earned building her empire while Bradley played house with a woman young enough to be his daughter, using Rose's success to fund his betrayal. But the most chilling discovery came in Marcus's follow-up report, delivered to Rose's office on a Tuesday afternoon while Bradley believed she was in back-to-back meetings. Marcus had expanded his investigation beyond the affair itself, looking into Bradley's recent activities, his communications, his movements that seemed unconnected to Jasmine. Bradley had consulted with Thomas Hartwell. Rose knew the name. Every high-net-worth individual in Atlanta knew Thomas Hartwell, the divorce attorney whose reputation was built on destroying prenuptial agreements and securing massive settlements for his clients. Hartwell specialized in equitable distribution cases, arguing that companies which grew substantially during marriages entitled spouses to portions of that growth, regardless of prenuptial protections. He'd broken ironclad agreements by claiming constructive abandonment, that spouses whose careers demanded excessive time and attention had emotionally abandoned their marriages, rendering prenuptial agreements unconscionable. Marcus had obtained legal bills, email correspondence, meeting notes. Bradley had consulted Hartwell 3 times over the past 6 weeks. The attorney had outlined a strategy. Document Rose's absences, her late nights, her business travel. Build a case that Rose's obsession with Turner Global constituted emotional abandonment. Argue that the company's exponential growth during their 8-year marriage, from a $50 million valuation when they married to over $800 million now, entitled Bradley to a substantial portion, potentially hundreds of millions, regardless of the prenuptial agreement they'd signed. Bradley wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to divorce Rose and claim half her empire while making it look like she'd driven him to it. Rose closed the report and sat in silence, looking out over Atlanta's skyline from her penthouse office. She'd built Turner Global through strategy, patience, and the ability to see 3 moves ahead of her competitors. Now she would apply those same skills to protecting everything she'd created. Bradley had underestimated her. He'd seen her success and assumed she was too busy, too distracted, too trusting to notice his betrayal. He'd planned his attack carefully, systematically, believing he held all the cards. He was wrong. And by the time Rose was finished, Bradley F. Nelson would learn exactly what happened when you declared war on a woman who'd conquered an industry by refusing to lose. Rachel Montgomery arrived at Rose's penthouse office at 4 p.m. on Thursday, carrying a leather briefcase that contained Marcus's surveillance reports and Dr. Williams's financial forensics. Rachel was 52, a partner at Atlanta's most prestigious family law firm, with a reputation for protecting high-net-worth clients in complex divorces. She'd represented CEOs, professional athletes, and old money families through some of the city's most contentious marital dissolutions. Rose had retained her services 2 years ago as a precautionary measure, never imagining she'd actually need her. Rachel closed her briefcase, satisfied that her client understood exactly what they were undertaking. Then let's get to work. By the time we're finished, Bradley F. Nelson will serve as a cautionary tale about what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest of Rose's life, and that was saying something for a woman who'd bootstrapped a billion-dollar company from a garage startup, survived 3 attempted hostile takeovers, and faced down boardrooms full of men who believed she didn't belong there. But nothing, not the 90-hour work weeks, not the investors who'd initially laughed at her pitch, not the competitors who tried to crush her when she was vulnerable. Nothing compared to the psychological endurance required to sleep next to Bradley F. Nelson while knowing exactly what he was. Every morning, Rose woke up beside a man who kissed her forehead and asked about her day. Every evening, she sat across from him at dinner while he talked about work stress and project deadlines, performing the role of devoted husband with an ease that made her stomach turn. Bradley remained affectionate, attentive, completely convinced his deception remained intact. On Tuesday of the first week, Bradley mentioned their anniversary was coming up. 8 years on the 18th. "I know you've been swamped with the Singapore office," he said over breakfast, "but I'd love to take you somewhere nice. Maybe that new French place in Buckhead you mentioned." Rose smiled, sipped her coffee, and agreed it sounded perfect, all while thinking about the Saturday morning 2 weeks away when Bradley would discover that his romantic gestures meant absolutely nothing to a woman who'd already seen him for exactly what he was. On Thursday, Bradley asked Rose to help him pick out a new suit for an important client presentation. They spent an hour at Neiman Marcus, Rose offering opinions on navy versus charcoal, nodding thoughtfully when Bradley explained how critical this presentation was for his partnership track. She watched him preen in front of the 3-way mirror, adjusting his tie, completely oblivious that in 10 days, Nelson and Associates would terminate him and the suit would be worthless for its intended purpose. Rose played her role flawlessly. She laughed at Bradley's jokes. She asked about his project deadlines. She initiated sex twice that week because that's what the old Rose would have done, and any deviation from normal patterns might alert Bradley that something had shifted. She lay beneath him, his hands on her body, his mouth on hers, and felt absolutely nothing except cold, strategic focus on the confrontation that was coming. Behind the scenes, Rachel Montgomery orchestrated the legal choreography with surgical precision. She met with Nelson and Associates managing partners, Jonathan Pierce and 2 other senior executives, presenting them with Marcus's evidence of Bradley's affair with Jasmine Reed. The photographs were damning. Bradley and Jasmine entering the Buckhead apartment during work hours, credit card receipts showing expensive lunches charged to the company card, text messages recovered through legal discovery showing Bradley using company resources to coordinate their meetings. Jonathan Pierce, the distinguished managing partner who'd mentored Bradley for 12 years, looked physically ill as he reviewed the documentation. "This is a liability nightmare," he said quietly. "If Jasmine or any other female employee claims Bradley used his senior position to coerce or pressure her, we're looking at lawsuits that could destroy this firm's reputation." Rachel had prepared for this moment. Ms. Turner has no interest in damaging Nelson and Associates. She recognizes that your firm was also victimized by Bradley's misconduct. What she requires is simple: Bradley's termination, effective the same day she confronts him. Coordinated timing protects both parties. The partners agreed immediately. They'd draft termination papers citing conduct violations and abuse of company resources. Bradley would be served Saturday morning, shortly after Rose's confrontation, ensuring he had no time to craft counter-narratives or protect himself professionally while his personal life imploded. Marcus Chen continued his surveillance, documenting Bradley and Jasmine's continued affair with meticulous precision. Every restaurant visit, every hour spent in the Buckhead apartment, every text message and phone call. Marcus built an archive that would demolish any claim Bradley might make about being a faithful, supportive husband driven away by Rose's career ambitions. Dr. Patricia Williams prepared the final financial forensics report, a masterpiece of accounting detective work that traced every stolen dollar, every fraudulent transfer, every dinner and gift and apartment payment that Bradley had funded with money he'd systematically siphoned from accounts Rose had filled through her labor. Patricia documented not just the $127,000 in direct theft, but also the pattern of deception, the careful structuring of transfers to avoid detection, the timing that coincided perfectly with the affair's progression, the deliberate exploitation of Rose's trust in their joint financial management. Each evening, Rose reviewed updates from her team. Rachel sent encrypted emails with legal strategy refinements. Marcus provided surveillance logs with timestamps and photographs. Patricia forwarded financial analysis showing Bradley's spending patterns. Rose approved every detail, every tactical decision, every element of the coordinated strike that would occur in. She counted the days, 9 days, then 7, then 5. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger was an emotion, and emotions were luxuries Rose couldn't afford when executing strategic warfare. Instead, she felt something colder, more useful: absolute clarity. Bradley had made a calculated decision to betray her, steal from her, and position himself to claim her empire. Now Rose would make an equally calculated decision to dismantle him completely, protecting everything she'd built while ensuring he understood the cost of underestimating her. On Friday night, 11 days into the waiting game, Bradley fell asleep with his arm around Rose's waist, his breathing deep and peaceful. Rose lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting down the hours until Saturday morning when everything would finally, definitively end. In 48 hours, Bradley would learn what every competitor who'd ever faced Rose H. Turner across a negotiating table eventually learned. She was always 3 moves ahead, always more prepared, and she never, ever lost. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. December sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Buckhead estate Rose would soon own outright. She'd been awake since 4 a.m., though she'd remained in bed until Bradley's alarm went off at 7:30, maintaining the fiction of normalcy until the final possible moment. Bradley had stretched, kissed her shoulder, and mentioned something about finally having a quiet weekend together. Rose had smiled and told him she'd make breakfast. Now, at 8:47 a.m., Rose sat at the head of their dining room table dressed in her black Tom Ford power suit, the one she wore to her most critical board meetings, the armor she donned when she needed to project absolute authority. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. Her makeup was flawless. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd built an empire and was now prepared to defend it with lethal precision. Rachel Montgomery sat to her right, a leather briefcase open beside her, divorce papers stacked and ready. Dr. Patricia Williams sat to her left, her 100-page financial forensics report arranged in 3 thick folders across the table. Between them lay photographs: Bradley and Jasmine at restaurants, entering the Buckhead apartment, walking hand in hand in Savannah. Bank statements highlighted in yellow showed every stolen dollar. Thomas Hartwell's consultation notes documented Bradley's scheme to claim Rose's fortune. The evidence of betrayal, methodically organized, impossible to deny. Rose heard Bradley's footsteps on the stairs, the lazy Saturday morning shuffle of a man expecting coffee and perhaps pancakes, a man who believed his deceptions remained perfectly hidden. He walked into the dining room in his pajamas, his hair still messy from sleep, and stopped cold. His eyes went to Rose first, taking in her suit, her composure, her boardroom posture. Then to Rachel and Dr. Williams, both women he'd met socially at Turner Global events, now sitting at his dining table with professional expressions that communicated nothing but serious business. Finally, his gaze dropped to the table, to the photographs, the documents, the inescapable evidence of everything he'd done. The color drained from Bradley's face. "Sit down, Bradley," Rose said, her voice as cold and controlled as it was when she negotiated hostile acquisitions. Not a request. A command. Bradley remained frozen for 3 seconds, his brain clearly trying to process what he was seeing, to construct some explanation or escape route. But there was nowhere to go, no story that could explain away photographs and bank statements and legal documents. Slowly, mechanically, he moved to the chair across from Rose and sat. Rose didn't waste time with preamble. She slid the first photograph across the table. Bradley and Jasmine at La Grata, hands intertwined across a candlelit table, time-stamped March 15th. "Your affair with Jasmine Reed began 8 months ago," Rose said, her tone clinical, detached. "3 weeks after I closed the Singapore deal. While I was celebrating the biggest professional victory of my career, you were planning my destruction." She slid more photographs. Bradley and Jasmine entering the Buckhead apartment. Bradley and Jasmine in Savannah during the weekend he'd claimed was a solo fishing trip. With each image, Bradley's face grew paler, his hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the table. "You've been systematically stealing from our joint accounts," Rose continued, sliding bank statements across the table. $127,000 over 8 months. You funded an apartment for Jasmine, $3,200 monthly. You bought her designer gifts. You took her on romantic weekends to places you claimed were too pretentious when I suggested them for our anniversary. Bradley's mouth opened, some excuse or explanation forming, but Rose cut him off with a gesture so sharp it might as well have been a blade. "I'm not here for your excuses," she said. "I'm here to tell you what happens next." She slid the divorce papers across the table, the prenuptial agreement enforcement clearly visible on the first page. "Our marriage is over, effective immediately. The prenuptial agreement will be fully enforced. You receive nothing from Turner Global, nothing from our home, nothing beyond what you brought into this marriage 8 years ago." Bradley found his voice, desperate and panicked. "Rose, please, we can talk about this. I made mistakes, but we can work through." "Be quiet," Rose said, her voice dropping to a register that made Rachel and Dr. Williams exchange glances. "I know about Thomas Hartwell. I know about your plan to claim constructive abandonment, to argue that my career constituted emotional neglect, to break our prenuptial agreement and claim hundreds of millions from Turner Global's growth. I know about the notes you've been keeping, documenting every late night I worked, every business trip I took, building a case to make me look like the villain in our marriage." She slid Hartwell's consultation notes across the table. Bradley's face crumbled as he recognized his own handwriting in the margins. His own schemes laid bare. "I also know," Rose continued, that Nelson and Associates managing partners have been informed of your conduct. You used company resources to conduct your affair. You charged dinners with Jasmine to your corporate card. You met her during work hours in company spaces. Jonathan Pierce is serving you with termination papers this morning. Your career in Atlanta is over. Bradley's hands were shaking now, his breathing shallow. You can't, Rose, you can't do this. We can negotiate. I'll walk away from everything. Rose stood, gathering her handbag, signaling to Rachel and Dr. Williams that they were finished here. But before she left, she leaned across the table, forcing Bradley to meet her eyes. I came to surprise you that day, Bradley, she said quietly. Each word precisely calibrated for maximum impact. 2 weeks ago, on a Wednesday afternoon, I brought you lunch from Sweet Auburn Barbecue, your favorite. I bought you that Asheville IPA you'd been wanting to try. I drove across town imagining your face lighting up when I walked through your office door, because I thought we had something worth fighting for. She paused, watching Bradley's confusion shift to dawning horror as he realized what she was saying. I saw you with her, Rose said, through the gap in your office door. I watched you stroke her hair. I watched you kiss her. And in that moment, I realized you never saw me as your partner. You saw me as your retirement plan. You saw my success as something to exploit, my trust as something to weaponize, my empire as something you were entitled to claim. Bradley's face crumbled completely, tears streaming down his cheeks, but Rose felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just cold, empty finality. You underestimated me, Rose said. That was your fatal mistake. She turned and walked out of the dining room, Rachel and Dr. Williams following. Behind her, she heard Bradley's voice, broken, desperate, begging for another chance. But Rose kept walking through the foyer, out the front door, into the December morning that felt crisp and clean and full of possibility. The weight that had crushed her chest for 2 weeks lifted. The performance was over. The war was won. And Rose H. Turner, billionaire, CEO, survivor, was finally completely free.
Thanks for sticking with us until the end of this story. If you enjoyed it, you're in for a real treat with the next one. It's even crazier and more captivating than you can imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next exciting chapter.